This is a fascinating and dramatic script. I can certainly rephrase it while maintaining the original flow, writing style, and articulation. I'll focus on subtly altering the word and phrase order, varying sentence starts, and using synonymous phrasing where appropriate to make it feel fresh while keeping the core narrative intact. The Deadly Deceit of Fort Smith, Arkansas. On October 15, 1888, something that would haunt the residents of Fort Smith, Arkansas, for generations was witnessed by the town. A wedding ceremony uniting 45-year-old Nathaniel Decker and 22-year-old Rose Sullivan occurred just 3 months after a mysterious hunting accident claimed the life of William Decker, Nathaniel's own son and Rose's original fiancé. What appeared as a grieving father extending protection to his deceased son's intended bride was, in reality, the conclusion of the most sinister and calculated love affair in Sebastian County's history. The passionate conspiracy involving the couple included 3 failed murder attempts, systematic poisoning, and ultimately a cold-blooded execution masked as a hunting mishap. A trail of evidence authorities deliberately ignored, and witnesses who mysteriously disappeared or died under suspicious circumstances whenever they spoke too freely about what they had observed, is revealed by local records carefully hidden in the Sebastian County Courthouse basement for over a century. Before we continue with the story of Nathaniel Decker and the woman who helped him murder his own flesh and blood, please make sure to subscribe to our channel and, in the comments, let us know what state you're listening from. This tale of family betrayal and forbidden desire will, because of its nature, make you question everything you thought you knew about the lengths people will go to for love. Along with William Decker, the truth about what actually took place in those Arkansas lumber camps had been buried, but the evidence was always there for those brave enough to look. Sebastian County in 1888 stood as one of Arkansas's most prosperous regions, built on the wealth that flowed from its vast timber industry and the bustling river trade along the Arkansas River. Growing from a frontier military post into a thriving commercial center, Fort Smith, the county seat, was where river merchants, cattle ranchers, and lumber barons competed for dominance in the rapidly expanding post-Civil War economy. Nathaniel Decker had arrived in Sebastian County 15 years earlier, an ambitious young man from Tennessee with the capital needed to purchase a failing sawmill and the vision to transform it into the largest lumber operation between the Indian Territory and Little Rock. By 1888, thousands of acres of prime timberland in the Ozark foothills were controlled by Decker Lumber Company, which employed over 200 men. From dawn to dusk, the sound of Nathaniel's steam-powered saws echoed through the Arkansas River Valley, and his lumber supplied construction projects as far away as New Orleans and Kansas City. At 45, Nathaniel cut an imposing figure in Fort Smith society. Standing 6 feet tall with penetrating blue eyes and steel-gray hair, he commanded respect through a carefully cultivated charm combined with business acumen. His late wife, Margaret, had died of consumption 3 years earlier, leaving him to raise their only son, William, then 23, who was already showing signs of the weak constitution that had long plagued the Decker men. William Decker represented everything his father both despised and loved about his own bloodline. The young man possessed his mother's gentle nature and his father's intelligence, but he lacked the ruthless drive that had built the family fortune. William saw obligation where Nathaniel saw opportunity. Where his father preferred compromise, William demanded results. At 26, the lumber company's bookkeeping and customer relations were managed by William, tasks that safely kept him away from the demanding physical labor and dangerous machinery his father believed were essential for building character. The lumber camps themselves sprawled across the heavily forested hills east of Fort Smith. A network of narrow-gauge railroad tracks that carried massive logs down to the Arkansas River connected them to the main mill. A rough collection of loggers, many of them German and Irish immigrants who had fled the industrial cities of the North seeking work in America's expanding frontier, were housed in these camps. They worked 6 days a week in conditions that claimed several lives each year, lived in crude bunkhouses, and spent their Saturday nights gambling and drinking in the taverns of Fort Smith's notorious River District. Stepping off the paddle-wheeler Memphis Belle with nothing but a worn carpet bag and a letter of introduction from William Decker, Rose Sullivan arrived into this masculine world of sudden death, sweat, and sawdust on a crisp September morning in 1888. Born in County Cork, Ireland, Rose had immigrated with her family to Boston when she was 7 years old. Her father, Patrick Sullivan, worked as a dock laborer until tuberculosis claimed him when Rose was 15. To support Rose and her two younger brothers, her mother, Bridget, took in sewing and washing, but the family constantly struggled against the anti-Irish prejudice that pervaded Boston's employment practices and against poverty. The family saw it as divine providence when a marriage broker approached Bridget Sullivan in the summer of 1888 with news that a prosperous Arkansas businessman sought a suitable Irish wife for his son. Through a series of Catholic parish networks, William Decker had placed his requirements: a young woman of good character, practical skills, and devout faith, who would be willing to travel west for marriage to a successful lumber heir. Rose possessed all these qualities, but she also carried something that had not been requested: an ambitious spirit and fierce intelligence that chafed against the limited opportunities available to Irish immigrant women in 1880s America. At 22, she had already worked as a tutor for wealthy Protestant families who paid her less than they paid their stable boys, a shopgirl, and a seamstress. Entry into a social class that had always been denied to people of her background, not just escape from poverty, was represented by the prospect of marrying a lumber company heir. Traveling by train to New York, then by riverboat down the Mississippi to the Arkansas River, her journey to Arkansas took 3 weeks. Detailed letters describing his family, his business, and his hopes for their future together, along with money for first-class accommodations, had been sent by William. His correspondence revealed a gentle, thoughtful young man who collected books, wrote poetry, and dreamed of expanding the family business into furniture manufacturing. But when Rose arrived in Fort Smith and met her intended husband at the Riverside Depot, she felt the first stirring of disappointment, which would ultimately lead to tragedy. Utterly unremarkable, financially secure, kind, and educated, William Decker was exactly as he had described himself in his letters. He greeted her with nervous politeness, helped her into his family's finest carriage, and spent the ride to their home apologizing for the rough appearance of the lumber work as they passed along the road, the heat, and the dust. The Decker Mansion, a 3-story Victorian home with ornate gingerbread trim, wraparound porches, and manicured gardens that showcased the family's prosperity, stood on Garrison Avenue, Fort Smith's most prestigious residential street. Until the wedding, scheduled for October 20th, just 6 weeks away, servants took Rose's belongings to the guest quarters where she would stay. It was at dinner that first evening that her carefully planned future began to unravel, and Rose met Nathaniel Decker. The Decker family dining room epitomized the refined luxury that timber wealth could purchase in 1888 Arkansas. Oil paintings of pastoral scenes decorated walls covered in rich burgundy wallpaper, while crystal chandeliers cast warm light over mahogany furniture imported from New Orleans. The table itself could comfortably seat 12 guests. Though on this particular September evening, only 3 place settings had been arranged on the crisp white linen tablecloth. Nathaniel, wearing a perfectly tailored black suit that emphasized his commanding height and broad shoulders, entered the dining room precisely at 7 o'clock as was his custom. Rose, who had been making polite conversation with William about his book collection, felt her breath catch as she watched Nathaniel move with the confident stride of a man accustomed to having his every word obeyed. "Father, may I present Miss Rose Sullivan?" William said, rising from his chair with the nervous energy that seemed to characterize all his movements. "Rose, this is my father, Nathaniel Decker." Nathaniel took Rose's offered hand in both of his, holding it a moment longer than propriety demanded, while his blue eyes studied her face with an intensity that made her pulse quicken. "Miss Sullivan," he said, his voice carrying the deep resonance of authority. "William's letters hardly did justice to your beauty. Welcome to our home." The compliment was inappropriate. A father should not comment so directly on his son's fiancée's appearance, but Rose found herself drawn to the boldness of it. After years of interacting with men who treated her as either a charity case or a servant, Nathaniel's direct appreciation felt like recognition of her worth as a woman rather than merely her utility as a wife. Throughout dinner, Rose found herself stealing glances at Nathaniel while William discussed his plans for their honeymoon trip to New Orleans. The father commanded the conversation without effort, sharing his experiences building an empire from nothing, his opinions on Arkansas politics, and stories of his business dealings. When he spoke about the challenges of managing thousands of acres of timberland and 200 employees, Rose heard the confidence of a man who shaped the world according to his will. By contrast, William seemed to shrink in his father's presence. He offered tentative opinions that he immediately qualified with phrases like, "Perhaps father sees it differently," or, "Of course I could be wrong." When Nathaniel asked about production figures from the main sawmill, William fumbled through his explanation, clearly nervous about making any statement that might contradict his father's expectations. "You must understand, Miss Sullivan," Nathaniel said, as dessert was served, "that William has many fine qualities, but business requires a certain ruthlessness that doesn't come naturally to him. He's too gentle for his own good." The comment was delivered with apparent affection, but Rose detected the steel beneath Nathaniel's words. Here was a man who felt no hesitation in exposing it and recognized weakness, even in his own son. After dinner, William offered to show Rose the family library, but Nathaniel interrupted. "Perhaps Miss Sullivan would enjoy seeing the timber operations. I'm riding out to Camp 3 tomorrow morning to inspect our new steam donkey. A woman planning to marry into the lumber business should understand where our prosperity originates." William opened his mouth to object. Clearly, he had planned a quiet morning introducing Rose to his poetry collection, but a command was carried in his father's suggestion. "Of course," William said weakly. "If Rose would find that interesting." Rose accepted immediately, though she couldn't have explained why. Something about Nathaniel's invitation felt dangerous, and danger had been absent from her carefully circumscribed life for far too long. A dangerous connection. The next morning dawned crisp and clear, with the first hints of autumn coloring the maple and oak trees that dotted the hills east of Fort Smith. Rose had dressed in her most practical outfit, a dark blue wool dress with minimal bustle that would allow her to ride side saddle without difficulty. When she arrived at the stables behind the Decker mansion, a powerful stallion for himself and a gentle mare for her were waiting with Nathaniel. William was nowhere to be seen. "My son sends his regrets," Nathaniel explained as he helped Rose mount her horse. "He received an urgent message from our timber agent in Van Buren, requiring immediate attention. Business, I'm afraid, waits for no one." Rose accepted this explanation, though something in Nathaniel's tone suggested that William's absence might not have been entirely coincidental. As they rode through the early morning mist toward the timber camps, she found herself studying her companion's profile, noting the way morning light caught the silver threads in his dark hair and the strong line of his jaw. Following rutted logging roads that wound through increasingly dense forest, the ride to Camp 3 took nearly 2 hours. Nathaniel proved to be an engaging companion, sharing stories about the early days of his lumber operation and pointing out landmarks that marked the expansion of his holdings over the years. He spoke with genuine passion about the work itself, the pride of transforming raw timber into lumber that would build homes and businesses across the expanding American frontier, the challenge of moving massive logs down treacherous mountain slopes, and the satisfaction of felling a magnificent oak that had stood for centuries. A collection of rough wooden buildings surrounded by enormous piles of freshly cut logs, Camp 3 occupied a clearing on a hillside overlooking the Arkansas River Valley. The new steam donkey, a steam-powered winch system for moving logs, stood at the center of the operation, its boiler already fired up and ready for the day's work. Rose had expected to observe from a safe distance while Nathaniel conducted his business, but he insisted on explaining every aspect of the operation. He showed her how the steam donkey's cable system could drag logs weighing several tons up slopes that would be impossible for horses to navigate. He pointed out the careful positioning of the guidelines that prevented the massive logs from crushing the workers below and breaking free. Guiding her hands as she learned to coordinate the throttle and cable release, he even allowed her to operate the steam donkey's controls. "You have good instincts," he told her as she successfully moved a 1,000-pound log into position. "Most women would be too frightened to try." "I'm not most women," Rose replied and immediately regretted the boldness of her response. Nathaniel smiled. "No, you certainly are not." They shared lunch at a rough wooden table outside the camp foreman's office, drinking coffee and eating sandwiches while Nathaniel reviewed production reports and discussed the next day's cutting schedule with his crew leaders. Rose noticed how the men responded to Nathaniel with respect certainly, but also with the weariness of employees who knew their jobs depended on maintaining their boss's approval. The conversation took a turn that would change everything during the ride back to Fort Smith. "Tell me about your expectations for marriage," Nathaniel said as they paused to rest their horses beside a creek that bubbled through a grove of hickory trees. Rose considered her answer carefully. "I expect to be a good wife, to support my husband's work, and to raise children who will continue the family name. "Those are admirable goals," Nathaniel replied. "But they don't tell me what you hope to gain from marriage beyond respectability and security." The question surprised Rose with its directness. In Boston, no one had ever asked what she hoped to gain from anything. Survival had been goal enough. "I suppose I hope to matter," she said finally. "To be part of something important, something that makes a difference in the world." Nathaniel dismounted and walked to the creek's edge, where he picked up a smooth stone and skipped it across the water's surface. "And do you believe marriage to William will provide that opportunity?" Rose felt heat rise in her cheeks. The question was inappropriate, potentially scandalous, but she found herself considering it seriously. "William is a good man," she said. "That's not what I asked." Rose dismounted as well, needing to move, to think, to understand why this conversation felt so necessary and so dangerous. "William is gentle and kind and educated. He will provide well for a family and treat his wife with respect and consideration." "Again, not what I asked." Rose turned to face him, noting how his blue eyes seemed to see through all her careful diplomatic responses to the truth beneath. "No," she said quietly. "I don't believe marriage to William will provide that opportunity. He's content to manage other people's decisions and implement other people's visions. He'll never build anything himself." "And building something matters to you?" "Yes." Nathaniel stepped closer. Close enough that Rose could smell the scent of wood smoke and pine needles that seemed to cling to his clothes. "Then you understand my dilemma. I've spent 25 years building something that will die with me because my son lacks the will to continue what I've started." Rose knew she should step back, should remount her horse, and insist they return to Fort Smith immediately. Instead, she found herself asking, "What do you intend to do about that?" Nathaniel's answer came not in words, but in the way his fingers brushed against hers as he helped her back into the saddle. The touch lasted only a moment, but it carried a promise that made Rose's heart race with equal parts terror and anticipation. They rode the rest of the way to Fort Smith in silence. But something fundamental had changed between them. When they arrived at the Decker mansion, William was waiting anxiously on the front porch, having returned from Van Buren hours earlier. "How was your ride?" he asked, his relief at their safe return evident in every word. "Educational," Rose replied, and caught Nathaniel's slight smile at her choice of words. That night, as Rose lay in her guest room bed, listening to the settling sounds of the unfamiliar house, she understood that she stood at a crossroads that would determine the entire course of her life. She could marry William as planned, accept the limited but comfortable future he offered, and spend her years wondering what might have been, or she could pursue the dangerous attraction she felt for Nathaniel, knowing that such a path would require choices that would horrify the woman she had been just 24 hours earlier. When sleep finally came, Rose dreamed of massive logs and steam donkeys and the feeling of strong hands guiding hers as she learned to control forces powerful enough to reshape the landscape itself. The web of deception. The weeks following Rose's visit to the timber camp established a routine that would have appeared perfectly innocent to any casual observer, but that slowly, systematically drew her deeper into Nathaniel's orbit. William, pleased with his fiancée's apparent interest in the family business, encouraged what he saw as her practical desire to understand their source of prosperity. He had no way of knowing that each business excursion, each private conversation about lumber operations, each moment Rose spent in his father's company was carefully orchestrated to feed a growing obsession that consumed both participants. Nathaniel found reasons to visit the mansion during the day when William was occupied at the main sawmill. He would arrive with business documents that required immediate attention, architectural plans for new facilities that needed review, or urgent messages from timber agents that couldn't wait for evening. These visits always included invitations for Rose to accompany him on brief errands, inspecting potential mill site locations, reviewing timber quality at the riverside lumber yards, or discussing equipment purchases with machinery dealers who had traveled from as far away as Chicago to court the Decker Lumber Company's business. Rose accepted each invitation with the eager interest of a woman preparing to become part of a business empire. She asked intelligent questions about profit margins and production costs, demonstrated remarkable aptitude for understanding the technical aspects of lumber grading and steam-powered equipment, and showed genuine fascination with the strategic challenges of managing such a complex operation. What neither admitted even to themselves during those early days was that the business discussions provided cover for a more intimate form of education. Nathaniel was teaching Rose to see the world through his eyes, to understand power as something that must be seized rather than granted, to recognize weakness as a luxury that successful people could not afford, and to appreciate the satisfaction that came from bending circumstances to one's will, rather than merely accepting what fate provided. William has never understood, Nathaniel explained as they rode through timber holdings on a crisp October morning, that in business, as in nature, only the strongest survive. He believes that being fair and reasonable will ensure success, but fairness is a luxury that only winners can afford. Rose found herself nodding at observations that would have appalled her just weeks earlier. He does seem to assume that other people will act honorably simply because he does. Exactly. And that assumption will destroy everything I've built unless someone with clearer vision assumes control. The implications of such statements hung in the air between them, never quite spoken aloud, but clearly understood. Nathaniel was not simply sharing business philosophy. He was recruiting a conspirator, testing Rose's willingness to embrace a worldview that placed desire above duty and ambition above morality. Meanwhile, William's own behavior began to change in subtle ways that only heightened the contrast between father and son, perhaps sensing some shift in the dynamics of his household, perhaps responding unconsciously to the tension that crackled in the air whenever the three of them were together. William became increasingly solicitous of Rose's comfort and increasingly deferential to his father's opinions. He began seeking Nathaniel's approval for decisions that should have been his own, asking permission to take Rose on afternoon walks, requesting advice about wedding plans that he should have discussed privately with his fiancée, and constantly qualifying his own preferences with phrases like, "Perhaps we should ask Father what he thinks," or, "Of course, Father might have a better idea." This difference, intended to demonstrate respect and maintain family harmony, had the opposite effect Rose might have hoped for. Instead of endearing William to her, his constant yielding to paternal authority made him seem weak and indecisive. Where Nathaniel commanded, William requested. Where Nathaniel decided, William deliberated. Where Nathaniel acted, William hesitated. Rose began to understand viscerally what Nathaniel meant about strength and weakness. She could see how William's gentle nature, so appealing in his letters, translated in person to an inability to claim his own space in the world, even in matters that directly concerned his own wedding. He seemed incapable of asserting preferences that might conflict with anyone else's opinions. The turning point came on October 8, just 12 days before the scheduled wedding ceremony. William had planned a private picnic for himself and Rose at Ozark Landing, a scenic spot along the Arkansas River, where paddle-wheelers stopped to take on timber from the Decker sawmill. He had arranged for the cook to prepare a special lunch, had commissioned the groundskeeper to gather autumn flowers for a bouquet, and had even composed a poem that he intended to read while they watched the sunset over the water. But when afternoon came, Nathaniel announced that urgent business required William's immediate attention at the main sawmill. A machinery breakdown threatened to halt production for several days unless repairs could be completed before the next morning's shift. As the person responsible for equipment maintenance schedules, William's presence was essential. "Perhaps you could postpone your picnic until tomorrow," Nathaniel suggested with apparent sympathy for his son's disappointment. William looked stricken. He had clearly been building toward this romantic gesture for days, planning every detail with the meticulous care he brought to all his endeavors. "Couldn't the repairs wait until tomorrow morning?" "The mill supervisor usually handles equipment problems." "The mill supervisor is down with fever," Nathaniel replied. "And the Chicago machinery dealer who can supply the replacement parts is leaving tomorrow afternoon. If we don't complete the repairs tonight, we'll lose a week of production." Rose watched this exchange with growing understanding of the power dynamics at play. Nathaniel had not simply requested William's help. He had structured the situation so that refusal would seem irresponsible and selfish. William could choose between his personal desires and his business obligations, but only one choice would meet his father's definition of mature behavior. "Of course," William said after a moment's hesitation, "business must come first. Rose will understand." But what Rose understood was that William would always choose the path that avoided conflict, even when that meant sacrificing his own happiness and disappointing the woman he claimed to love. "I'm terribly sorry, Rose," William continued, his distress genuine. We'll have our picnic tomorrow. I promise. The sunset will be just as beautiful. Nathaniel, however, had a different suggestion. Perhaps Rose would enjoy seeing the mill operations while you're working on the repairs. She's shown such interest in learning about the business, and this would be an excellent opportunity to observe our nighttime procedures. William brightened at this proposal. His father's offer to entertain Rose while he worked seemed like the perfect solution. It demonstrated Nathaniel's kindness while ensuring that Rose wouldn't spend the evening alone and disappointed. "Would you mind terribly, Rose?" William asked. "Father knows the mill operations better than anyone, and you did say you wanted to understand every aspect of the lumber business." Rose agreed with apparent enthusiasm, though her real excitement had nothing to do with learning about sawmill procedures. She was beginning to recognize Nathaniel's manipulations for what they were, not accidental circumstances, but carefully orchestrated opportunities. The machinery breakdown might have been genuine, but Nathaniel's suggestion that Rose accompany him to the mill while William worked was clearly premeditated. As evening approached and William departed for the main sawmill with his tools and repair manuals, Rose found herself alone with Nathaniel for the first time since their ride to the timber camp. The house felt different without William's presence, larger somehow and charged with possibilities that had previously existed only in stolen glances and carefully ambiguous conversations. "Shall we go to the mill?" Nathaniel asked as they stood together in the front hallway. Rose met his gaze directly, understanding that her answer would determine whether they continued their elaborate pretense of proper behavior or acknowledged the attraction that had been building between them for weeks. "I'd rather not," she said quietly. Nathaniel smiled, and in that smile, Rose saw both promise and warning. They had crossed a line from which there would be no retreat. The mill visit that never happened marked the beginning of what both Rose and Nathaniel would later remember as the most intoxicating and dangerous month of their lives. Instead of touring sawmill operations, they spent that October evening walking through the darkened gardens behind the Decker mansion, talking with the intensity of people discovering fundamental truths about themselves and each other. "I've been married," Nathaniel said as they paused beside the fountain at the garden center. "I understand the difference between affection and passion. William offers you one, I could offer you the other." Rose felt her pulse quicken at his directness. "William is your son." "Yes, he is. And that makes what I'm feeling both impossible and inevitable." They stood close enough in the moonlight that Rose could see the silver threading through Nathaniel's dark hair, could observe the way his jaw tightened as he struggled with emotions that clearly surprised him with their intensity. Here was a man who had built an empire through careful planning and calculated decisions. Yet he was confessing to desires that defied all logic and propriety. "What are you suggesting?" Rose asked, though she already knew the answer. "I'm suggesting that some hungers are too powerful to ignore regardless of their inconvenience." Rose turned away, needing space to think clearly. "And William? William will survive disappointment. He survived it before." The callousness of this statement should have horrified Rose, but instead she found herself considering its practical implications. In Boston, she had been nobody, an Irish immigrant girl whose best hope was marriage to a dock worker or factory foreman who might provide basic security in exchange for housekeeping and childbearing services. William offered escape from that destiny. But Nathaniel offered something far more intoxicating, the opportunity to share real power, to help shape a business empire that would outlast both their lives. "I need time to think," she said finally. Nathaniel accepted this with the patience of a man confident in his ultimate victory. "Of course, but don't wait too long. Some opportunities don't present themselves twice." The next morning brought William's effusive apologies for the previous evening's disappointment, along with promises that such business emergencies would never again interfere with their personal time. He had worked until nearly dawn completing the machinery repairs, and his exhaustion made him even more solicitous than usual about Rose's comfort and happiness. "Did Father give you an interesting tour of the mill?" he asked over breakfast, clearly hoping that Nathaniel's attention had compensated for his own absence. "We didn't actually visit the mill," Rose replied carefully. "Your father felt it would be inappropriate for a lady to observe industrial operations after dark." William accepted this explanation without question, his relief evident. He had been struggling with guilt about leaving Rose alone on what was supposed to be their special evening, and learning that she had been properly chaperoned eased his conscience considerably. What William didn't notice was the brief look that passed between Rose and Nathaniel as she delivered this careful version of the truth. It was the first of many small lies they would tell together, the beginning of a conspiracy that would gradually expand to encompass much larger deceptions. Over the following days, Nathaniel found increasingly creative reasons to spend time alone with Rose. A potential property purchase required someone with feminine perspective to evaluate the condition of the house and outbuildings. A meeting with New Orleans lumber buyers needed social support that only a refined lady could provide. Equipment suppliers visiting from Chicago expected to be entertained with the kind of cultivated conversation that business dinners demanded. William not only approved of these activities, but actively encouraged them. His father's willingness to include Rose in business matters seemed to demonstrate acceptance of her as a future family member, while Rose's eagerness to participate suggested genuine interest in understanding the source of their prosperity. That his fiancée and his father seemed to enjoy each other's company struck William as evidence of his good fortune rather than cause for concern. But Fortune Smith's more observant residents began to notice patterns.